Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and it's really a special treat for me to be hosting Tom Ricks, who's here to talk about his new novel, We Can't Save You, A Tale of Politics, Murder, and Maine. The reason it's a special treat for me to be introducing Tom is because he and I covered the Pentagon together at the Washington Post many, many years ago. And I was then and have remained a great admirer of Tom's very impressive researching and writing talents. Of course, much of the focus of his work remained for many years on the military. He had quite an illustrious career in journalism, covering military operations in Somalia and Bosnia and Afghanistan and Iraq. And several of his most popular and critically acclaimed books are on military topics, such as the war in Iraq, commanding generals, and the U.S. Marine Corps. And even when he came out several years ago with a book about the civil rights movement, Tom applied a military lens to reassess the movement's history. Then last year, he kind of surprised a number of us because he ventured away from the real world of the military and into the fictional world of a murder mystery. In Everyone Knows But You, he introduced Ryan, is it Tapia? Is that right? Sure. Yeah, sure. Pronounce it any way you want. Ryan Tapia, who's a veteran FBI agent who moves from California to Maine after his wife and kids are killed in a car accident. Ryan is assigned to investigate the killing of a lobsterman whose body has washed up on the shores of Liberty Island near Acadia National Park. The fisherman's boat was found in waters controlled by a Native American tribe, which leads Ryan in his search for answers into the fraught relations between white Mainers and their indigenous neighbors, and also into a couple of illicit coastal trades, hard drugs, and rare fish. Tom showed in that book quite a fine grasp of the environs and people of Maine, a state where he worked in his youth and where he has spent quite a bit of time over the last dozen years or so since he and his family moved away from Washington. A positive review of that previous book, Everyone Knows But You, a review in Publishers Weekly at the time concluded with this sentence: "A sequel would be welcome." Well, here it is, and We Can't Save You. Ryan is back, and so are Maine's Native Americans, and this time Ryan is assigned to monitor a group of Native Americans that are protesting climate change and its effects on the waters and woods of Maine. Protesters have their detractors, including the U.S. president, and senior FBI agents want to quash the movement, but Ryan grows sympathetic to the movement's cause, which puts him in quite a dilemma and makes for some suspenseful twists and turns. Now, lest you think Tom has left all his vast knowledge of the military behind, there is well, it's fictitious, but it's kind of based in some reality. There is a POW, old POW camp in Maine, called Camp Cripple, that factors significantly in the novel, and I guess there's some Black Hawks, too, that are flying around, reminiscent of the military. So Tom will lay all this out for you in a minute. Let's please give Tom Ricks a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Brad. It's nice to see that Brad and I have both moved from our jobs at the Post on to legitimate work. And it's kind of amazing that people have these second lives, but I'm glad we do. And also, congratulations to Politics and Prose for toughing it out. it really strikes me coming back to Washington now, this feels to me like a city under siege. People have a kind of deer in the headlights look as you walk along the sidewalks. This is one place in here where it actually feels like a community. And I think politics and prose in times like this becomes more and more important as a, if you will, a warm fireplace, a warm hearth that like-minded people can come in and gather around and remember that there are better ways to live than the way this country currently is being led. Stephen King, a better-known Maine writer than me, wrote a terrific book about writing called On Writing. He's put out several editions of it. In it, he mentions that the ideas for his books frequently begin with the question, what if? I was glad to read that because that's exactly how this book began for me. I had come off writing a book about the civil rights movement, Waging a Good War, which, by the way, I think is my best book, even though it's the worst selling one. I didn't know people that wouldn't read about the civil rights movement, but that's just me. But it's a good book, and I was thinking about it afterwards, and I thought to myself, what if some of America's Indians, and in Maine, some of the tribes do still call themselves Indians. If you look at the Great Seal of the Penobscot Nation, it says Penobscot Indian Tribe. What if some of America's Indians launched an intrusive, aggressive, nonviolent public action similar to the classic civil rights movement of the 1960s? And then I asked myself what would make that happen, and a good obvious answer was global overheating. It's a natural. After all, the Native Americans came to North America through climate change. Because of the Great Ice Age, there was a land bridge from Asia to Alaska. They came down that, and when the ice was still all over the continent, they managed to come down the coast and then move across North America. It was the end of the Ice Age that actually brought Native Americans to Maine for the first time about 10,000 years ago. Almost none of you have read the book, so I thought I'd begin by reading one section. For those of you who already have a book in hand or reading along at home, I'm going to the bottom of page 84. Here are two of the Indian organizers discussing what they're going to do about global overheating, how to think about it. First things first, James said, reaching back to the lessons he had learned from the Starbucks organizer in Montreal. First, who are we? It was a classic strategic move. Begin with self-definition. Only when you figure out who you are can you begin to figure out your goals. That leads to what to do, and next to how to do it. He pointed to a teenager standing in the back. Your thoughts? The kid said, well, we're a bunch of pissed off Indians. Yes, we sure are, said James. And why? Because of the land and the water getting fucked up, another kid in the back said. This climate shit you fellas are protesting. Yes, tell me more. That led to several hours of discussion, what people were seeing, how they felt about it, what might be done. Paul and James let it ramble, but emphasized the points of agreement that emerged. People needed to try on ideas, think through them, see how they fit. In the process, they began to feel less like a collection of individuals and more like people who understood and sympathized with each other, that is, a genuine group. James said, like John of Tides said, John of Tides being an Indian elder who's an expert in tides. It's not the land that belongs to us. We belong to the land. We live with it, on it, work with it, preserve it. We don't consume it, and we don't burn it. Paul, this is Paul Soco, another Indian leader you may remember from the previous novel. His nickname is Peeled Paul because he lives naked on an island. Paul, but that's not what this country is built on. James, damn straight. This country was built on the theft of land from us, on the stolen labor of black people held captive, and on the idea of freedom for some people, but rarely for all people. By mid-afternoon, they'd hammered out their motto, "We belong to the land." Paul, so what does that point to? James, I think a march through the land to declare our loyalty to it. James, in this novel, is James Revere, is kind of based on one of the more fascinating people in the classic American civil rights movement, James Bevel. This isn't the most exciting scene of the book, but I wanted to read it because it tells you who these characters are, what they're thinking. This is the lighting of the fuse for this summer-long march they end up conducting down the coast of Maine, where they decide to occupy the unoccupied mansions of the summer people down the coast. To begin my research, I read as much as I could about Maine's Indians, their histories, their myths, their views, their religion, their stories. I got every book I could out of the library in Blue Hill, Maine. When I finished those, I started doing the Maine Cat, which is a great system. Any library in Maine will ship you their books. And I was getting these obscure histories, memoirs of life in a German POW camp, in picking potatoes and cutting lumber in Maine in World War II. The Americans, by the way, treated the German prisoners so well. A lot of them remained in America, married local farm girls. They also fed them extremely well, including meat, real beer, and real tobacco, which many of these guys hadn't seen for many years. They were kind of astonished, actually, when some of the Germans began gaining weight. I was especially taken, though, in the books of Indian history I read with their proverbs. I think good proverbs get you quickly to the essence of a culture. One main Indian proverb I liked and really was puzzled by, I'm still not sure what it means, and it's actually used in the novel, everyone has got to skin their own skunk. It's an odd image. I mean, why would you skin a skunk? And it sort of means, this pungent image means you deal with what life hands you. And if you got to skin a skunk, skin that skunk. It's the phrases, I think, that we don't understand, the proverbs that seem kind of puzzling, that especially can be enlightening, that tell you there's something you don't quite understand about a culture. Another Indian proverb I like from Maine, a man must learn to carry his grief. I think I know what it means, but boy, is it a hard and interesting proverb to meditate. How do you learn to carry grief? I mean, there's just a lot packed into those short few words. There's also an Indian custom regarding thunder. When you hear summer thunder in the distance, you say, "Hurry along, grandfather. You're related to me, but later, move on," which is an interesting sort of handling of family relations. I also like how in the Micmac language of the Penobscot and other tribes in Maine and further into Canada, plural nouns always have an S. Like a character says, the kids at school would make fun of me because I'd say, "Pass the spaghettis." And there's a character, she's actually named Seaweeds because she goes to the beach with her class and she says, "Look at all the seaweeds." And they start laughing at her. It's called seaweed. Her nickname becomes Seaweeds. And there's a character actually in the novel talking about the vindictive reactionary American president. He says, "Look, he's so strong, his voice could blow all the hairs off my head." So another Indian expression I like, because it kind of reminded me of Trump. Yeah, his voice could blow the hairs off your head. That doesn't mean it makes any sense. Another aspect of Maine Indian life that surprised me was the profound dislike of game wardens. You know, we have this image of sort of game wardens as guys who go out and, protect nature and stuff. Indians hate game wardens generally. This is because a lot of Indians still believe that under their treaty agreements, they have a right to hunt anywhere at any time. And game wardens disagree with that. They say, no, you have to only hunt in hunting season and so on. When Indians hunt, there's a custom of sharing meat that still is broadly observed. 1/4 to the shooter, 1/4 of the meat to the shooter's hunting partner, because you always hunt with a partner, and 1/2 to the rest of the village. And so when a hunter is arrested and jailed, the whole village feels it. As one Indian autobiography put it, to them, the game warden's hat meant empty stomachs, hunger. You only have so many good hunters. If one of them's in jail and can't get out because nobody has any money to bail him out, people will go hungry. Which leads to another Indian phrase I like, and all these are quoted, used in dialogue in the story. When I see him talk, I hear the hissing of snakes. A wonderful sort of usage. Next, in my research, I read a ton about global warming, or more accurately, global overheating. I don't have anything new to say about the subject except this: the more I read, the more I am persuaded we are in deep, deep trouble. Basically, we're screwed. The current solutions aren't enough. Sustainability is a false hope. One character says, trying to make global overheating more sustainable is trying to make slavery kinder. It ain't going to work. It's not going to happen. You need to operate differently. I also became persuaded that capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and global overheating go hand in hand. They really began together, they exploded together, and they are now burning the earth, which leads the characters in the novel to refer to Anglo-American culture as world burners. We're all burners. And at one point, one guy says, I don't talk to burners anymore. When I combined global overheating with the history of Native Americans on this continent, something else really struck me. How much Native American history is tied up with climate change going back 10,000 years. As I said, the first Native Americans come to North America across the land bridge created by the Ice Age. They moved across the continent and into Maine 10,000 years, and they actually watched the glaciers recede in Maine about a mile a year for hundreds of years, to the point at which in some of the myths of Maine's Indians, there are stories about fighting the people who lived on the ice. They've preserved this memory of 10,000 years ago. Their god, Goosecop, is a particularly interesting character. He's not like a Old Testament god. He walks around with his hands in his pants, kind of whistling and looking for things that he might improve. And so he goes one day during the megafauna era, which is early human hunting era. The humans killed all the large animals, the woolly mammoth and so on. Beavers back then were about 9 feet long. But in the myth, Goosecop goes to Mr. Beaver and says, Mr. Beaver, you're too big. I'm going to shrink you. And he does. And they remember actually the waterfalls coming off the glaciers. And Goosecop goes and says, Mr. River, these rapids are ridiculous. I'm going to smooth you down. And he does. What I like also is that one day Mrs. Groundhog goes to him and says, Goosecop, it is not right to live alone. I will adopt you. So she adopts God, and he moves in with Mrs. Groundhog. Thinking about all that led me to another one of Stephen King's what ifs. At one point, a character starts thinking, he says, look at it this way. The Indians had 9,000 great years in North America. They had abundant game, all they needed. They had all the fish in the world. Shellfish. You could reach into streams and pull out fish. Life was good. And then 400 years ago, around 1500, 1600, things took a big turn for the worse. Europeans appeared, and they brought new diseases, especially smallpox. They had different weapons, pistols, muskets, cannons. They had steel for knives and swords and saws and axes. They wiped out entire species. They reduced the herds of deer, and most of all, they took the land. And these are actually issues that come up in the Indian treaties, especially in Maine. I'm referring to these treaties that the tribes signed with the British before the United States existed. One of the complaints they make frequently is, you people don't know how to manage the deer population. You kill too many of the young ones. You need to let them eat in the winter, don't kill them. And we also don't like the way you treat our waterfalls and put mills in them, because we also fish there every year. This is the what if, looking at that. There was a feeling in America by the 19th century that there simply was no place on this planet for the Native American. Horace Greeley, the great newspaper editor of the 19th century, wrote that these people must die out. There is no help for them. They must die out. But what if, I have one character say, what if the shoe's now on the other foot? What if it turns out that our way of life, he says, the Native American way of life, especially in rural Maine, is tailor-made for global overheating. We know how to deal with epidemics, with storms, with interruptions in supply changes. When you people have nothing in your grocery stores, we're going to be going hunting. And that's what the lead characters come to believe as they decide to detach from what they see as a doomed American culture. And that's why at the end, the James character says, we can't save you. It's his message to American culture. Finally, as in my previous book, Maine is a real character in this novel. I really love Maine. It is such a different place than the rest of the country, even down to its laws. Its land of law use, its tradition and its precedents is different from the rest of the country. The land of law use there is permissive use. That means you can go onto any property for hunting and fishing if it is not explicitly by sign stated that you cannot. And the inclination of the law is anybody can use the land because it is the commonwealth of the people, hence the term commonwealth, which is what Massachusetts, which is what Maine was part of, originally was called the Commonwealth. By the way, Maine also is the only state in the Union that under treaty, the Native American tribes hold seats in the state legislature. Depends, 2 or 3, depending on certain circumstances. But by treaty, they have those. In the 1920s, when white supremacism had its last big burst before now, the votes were taken away, but they couldn't alter the treaty, so they had to leave the Indians in the legislature. They just said, you can't vote anymore. The Indians said, fine, we don't want to vote. That's because we're sovereign nations, but we're going to sit here and observe you. In this story, by the way, as Brad alluded to, I have the governor of Maine, a female, get in a political smackdown with this vindictive American president. I wrote that a year ago, before Governor Mills and Donald Trump had their real-life confrontation. That takes care of my prepared remarks. Again, thank you very much to Politics and Prose for having me. I'm happy to listen to your questions, denunciations, reactions. Just one request, Brad and I used to be reporters. We got thick skins. If we could take it from Donald Rumsfeld, we can take it from you. So fire when ready. I think you're supposed to walk up to the microphone and state your questions if you like. And if you don't start asking questions, I'll start calling on you.
I'm interested in this Ryan Tapia, the character.
Mm-hmm.
How has he grown and changed from the previous book?
Thank you, sir. Ryan Tapia, who's the lead character, the FBI investigator. One thing that it's been really fun for me is learning how to write fiction and being taught by my editors on both of these books about how to think about fiction. Especially, I've written 8 nonfiction books coming into it. One thing an editor said to me is your lead character must suffer. And he must suffer, he or she, but in this case he, must suffer more than you want. Your darling has to get his fingers stepped on, or worse. So he has a hard time. In the first book, he's lost his family, he's kind of in despair, he's kind of wasting away. In this book, he finds himself growing resurgent, but in a changed way, and increasingly becoming alienated by his employer, the FBI. He's trying to do the right thing. He says he's trying to tell his boss, look, the FBI is not the natural enemy of the American Indian. We can do better than we have. Places like, the reservations we shot up in the 1970s and so on. And his boss basically says, look, you're not paid to sing Kumbaya. You're paid to fight, to get dirt on these guys so we can manipulate them. And that leads to a confrontation. I don't have a lot of respect for the FBI. I feel sorry for them now. I'm not even sure that they deserve everything that's happening to them with these morons leading them now. But the FBI really did a lot of bad things in American history. The more I read about the FBI, the more disgusted I was. My 4th novel actually is a meditation looking at the FBI's war on the Black Panthers in the late 1960s, which really is a story that has not yet been told. My guess is that the FBI, mainly working through local police, killed more than 600 Black Panthers, including things like giving them bombs and then detonating them as they drove away with them. So this guy is kind of coming to reconsider the FBI. The second thing my editors taught me, which I really was intrigued by, he said, Tom, you're a best-selling nonfiction author. You're a not at all selling fiction author at this point. This was, we're working on the first book. And he said, what you really need to learn, the single biggest difference between nonfiction and fiction, is in fiction, you use dialogue to reveal character and advance the plot. And it's a really hard lesson to learn. When you're writing nonfiction, dialogue is whatever was actually said. And he said, no, here it has to be somebody that shows me. Sometimes you're going to have a character say one thing and do another thing. You really need to have your dialogue as the engine that drives this truck. And it was a whole new way of thinking. I'm still absorbing it. My wife is on a similar path, and so we have a lot of dinner table conversations about this. Fortunately for her, she has this great lead character, Abraham Lincoln, who just, the dialogue just bounces out of him. I don't have anybody that good. Yes, please.
Thank you. I just had a process question about writing multiple books in a series. Like, do you map it all out at the first book, or how do you choose which storylines to tease out?
Good question. Something else I learned is when I signed the contract for the first fiction, they said, you need to understand, you can't just do one of these. You got to write a bunch of them. And I said, okay, I'm enjoying it. They said there's sort of a moral obligation to commit to a series. I didn't know what the whole series would be, but I quickly learned this is a great way for Tom Ricks to vent. And so I thought about things that piss me off, things that really bother me, things that I wake up in the middle of the night wondering, why doesn't this country do more about this? So novel 2 is basically how global overheating really starts changing the politics of a state. Novel 3, which is finished in the pipeline, I'll probably get the edited version this fall, is a look at how the oligarchy smashes a small town in Maine in pursuit of red carbide. Carbide is actually not found in America. It's mainly coming out of South Congo right now, and it's very destructive in its mining and so on. But I posit that a vein of carbide is found in northern Maine, and the oligarchy basically says, it's ours now. And the lesson that one character says is, in America, litigation, $10 million, fine, you'll get fair litigation. If the stakes are 100 million or more, no. The oligarchy will dictate terms. And that's about the oligarchy just coming in and smashing, doing things like buying up the local newspaper and putting a right-wing kid out of Harvard as the editor, setting up a local doctor so they can kind of get him out of the way, actually killing a local lawyer who's sniffing around too much, stuff like that. Very much the octopus Frank Norris, which I went and read kind of for my model. And then the third, that's the third one. And the fourth one is the Panthers novel, and for which I've been reading. A friend of mine who was actually a very old lawyer gave me the grand jury proceedings of an inquiry into the behavior of the Chicago police with the Panthers. This goes back to the killings of Fred Hampton and many other people, which were just flat out massacre. I mean, and the police just lied. They did a reenactment for TV cameras in which they lied. The actual account looks like in one of the incidents, I believe, they said they fired at us and we fired back. The actual accounting was one Black Panther bullet and 112 police bullets. The one Black Panther bullet appears to be when a guy picked up a weapon and was shot and he flinched and the bullet went into the ceiling. These were just setups. So I did a lot of research on the Black Panthers, but the fun of fiction is you can write what you really think happened, not what you can prove happened, which I highly recommend for fiction. How are we doing on time? Okay.
I'll give you a quick shout out on your civil rights novel. My cousin, who's 89 years old and actually lived in Birmingham, was a leading politician, read your book. I gave it to him as soon as it came out, and he said he knew a lot of those people, and he said you nailed it. It was very, very well written, and he very much enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. That actually, it's nice to hear. I mean, that little book on the civil rights movement, Waging a Good War, it has its own life. I hear from Black ministers and from trade union organizers. Right. This Black minister was telling me, oh yeah, it's our Bible study book this year. And I said, Bible study? He said, yeah, actually, I can relate a passage in the Bible to each of your chapters.
Right. Well, it may stand the test of times, and down the road, people will look at it as a good compilation of the time. I had a very simplistic question about the novel. You got such a rich mining operation going in Maine. I know you spent some time in Texas. Boy, you got a lot of stuff down there if you get bored doing Maine novels.
I'd love to write about Texas, but I don't think I'll ever understand it and know it as well to write it like I can write Maine. Right. I mean, you know, there are such these little tiny differences. I remember we lived on Deer Isle year-round for several years, and right next to our island, Deer Isle, is a little island called Little Deer. And one day I was talking to a friend of mine, a local used car dealer named Ron Gross, and he said something about Little Deer. And I said, yeah, those Little Deer people. And he broke up laughing because he said, that's right, we always make fun of Little Deer people. They're totally different, you know. And they're different in ways that you don't want to know.
Well, just a quick one on the novel. My wife is the novelist in the family. She probably reads more novels than anybody I know. But I've often wondered, when you pick characters' names and you come up with those, have you got a formula? Have you got some sort of a test that you use to make a logic of all?
The question is, I don't know if you heard it, how do I come up with characters' names? It's something I really enjoy. And I'm glad you asked, because nobody ever asked about this. Frequently, there's a message in the name, at least to myself. So in novel, actually, I think he appears in novel 1. No, I can't remember. There's a doctor named Doc Healy. You know, he's a healer. What my wife and I were talking about this once, how many often people have names that seem to relate. She had a swim teacher named Don Drown, I think his name was. The harbor master in Bar Harbor, Maine is named Wharf. So I kind of play with that a little bit. Though Ryan Tapia, specifically, I wanted something that connoted Irish, Ryan, and something that connoted Hispanic, Tapia, from Southern California, as sort of outside Maine's Protestant mainstream. So he's Hispanic kind of a background, maybe Catholic, California suburban, almost the opposite of Maine. And in Maine, I paid a lot of attention to the names in the first novel. Every name of the islanders in the first novel is actually drawn from the logs of the Revolutionary War units of Maine, which are all online because they were all for pensions. These are people who put in for pensions. I served in. So all the names, I just would take names, even odd names. There was a guy whose first name was Guppy in the Revolution, and I just liked that. So I sort of play with those. The drug dealer in the first one, who kind of is the moralizing drug dealer, who says, "Look, I'm just providing a service just like you provide lobsters. I provide heroin. People have it. People need it." His name was Absalom Buck. He's known as Abby Buck. Absalom Buck was a Revolutionary War soldier. It's an odd thing about Deer Isle, the place we live, is a lot of people actually have the names of local land features. And it's sort of, well, man, they've been there for 300 years. You go over, the guy who fiberglassed my sailboat, the deck, was named Stinson. And I said, well, where do you live? I'll come and get the boat. He said, Stinson's Neck, of course. Where else would Stinson live? And the woman who cleaned our house at one point, her last name was Sylvester. She was from Sylvester's Cove, which has been there for 300 years. The old saying on Deer Isle is, you're not an islander unless you were born there. The old joke is the kid is assigned one day in first grade to write an essay about Abraham Lincoln. And he says, Abraham Lincoln was our first president. He was born off island. Yes, sir.
Yes, wanted to ask you a little bit about the craft of specifically writing mysteries, and who were your influences? Which mystery writers do you like? And can you talk a little bit about how you build a mystery? It strikes me as a very difficult thing to do.
Doesn't that sound like the name of an album, Building a Mystery? What was her name? Sarah McLachlan? There you go. I am not an expert on this, so I'm not going to hold forth and pretend I am. I am still learning, which is the fun of it. One of my editors said to me, you got a lot of nerve starting to write fiction in your 60s. He said, but I admire you're trying to do it, so I'll help you. I was never a huge mystery fan myself, and so I asked one of these editors, actually George Gibson, for a list. Dialogue and pacing, he said, are the two things I really want you to study. Dashiell Hammett was his, what's it called, Red Harvest. He said, start with Hammett, Red Harvest, and then it was Ross MacDonald, and I realized that basically Ross MacDonald, the movie Chinatown basically is a gloss on Ross MacDonald's works. It's just, but I found so many of them were about California. I didn't want to read any more mysteries set in California. I'd read them all. And so I asked him, and I can't remember how, it led me to some other ones. And then Mary Kay, my wife, for Christmas gave me the Library of America crime fiction of the 60s. And as you know, Chester Himes' novel, which was in there, one of them, jumped out at me. And I became a huge Chester Himes junkie. I'm still discovering books by him. You actually had 3 I'd never heard of. But I've read, I think, 9 of his novels now. Chester Himes is magnificent. He's sort of, I think, the Mark Twain of mystery writers. He's black. Most of his novels are set in Harlem. The famous one is Cotton Comes to Harlem because it was made into a movie in the late 60s with Godfrey Cambridge and somebody else. And then another one actually later on, A Rage in Harlem. I just find him magnificent. And if you agree with Albert Murray that black culture is at the heart of American culture, then Harlem was at the heart of Black American culture in the 50s. This guy is taking you to the heart of the country. I got to say also, something we both learned as Pentagon correspondents covering the military, violence is American as apple pie. And if you're going to write about America, you write about violence. And there's one scene in Chester Himes where a guy pulls a knife on a bartender in a Harlem bar. The bartender reaches under and grabs a razor-sharp hatchet and just brings it down across the guy's arm. And the forearm goes flying across the room, still holding the knife. And he revels in this, Chester Himes. There's another scene, one of the better books, begins actually with some robbers robbing a fundraising for a Back to Africa movement. And one of the bodyguards is eating a sausage sandwich. And he just has this scene of the guy getting shot in the head. And it says, teeth, sausages, flying everywhere. Himes just revels. Himes is very interesting, though. Parents were Black professors at a historically Black college. He winds up in Ohio State prison, has a long-term gay affair in prison, writes about it later, then comes out and writes these novels, and eventually moves to France and spends the rest of his life. There's actually a book that came out recently I haven't read yet about Himes, James Baldwin, and a jazz musician, all three Black Americans in Paris in the 50s. And it sounds fascinating. Can't remember the name of it, though.
So how do you build a mystery?
I don't know. You wake up at 1 in the morning worrying about the world. I think about situations and really difficult situations and how to address them. I love inventing a character and throwing them into trouble. I was talking, actually, there's a good novelist, Tess Gerritsen, and I did an appearance last year in Maine. And I was talking to this guy, and he said, I've written a novel. I have the plot all done. Now I have just to figure out the characters. And she went, my God, plot comes from character. And I think that's totally true. You invent the character, you think of the characters and their contradictions and their problems, let them bang together like atoms, and the reactions from that create your plot. I don't know how the novel's going to end when I begin it, but I have questions. And in the previous one, Everybody Knows But You, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write a novel in which everybody knows what's going on but the poor schmuck investigating it? And they all do on this island. They all know basically what the murder was, except the guy who was investigated. And what happens if he solves it by finding an absence, not the actual murder weapon, but he realizes that the murder weapon is the thing missing from the toolbox. So all he has to do is look in people's toolboxes and see what's missing. So I was playing with a lot of intellectual ideas of absence and everybody else knowing, turning things upside down. I did get a note from my editor on the current novel. She said, Tom, I really like this novel, I'm buying it, but please could you show some deference to the genre? She said, you can't just write about whatever is interesting to Tom Ricks right now. You actually have to have a plot. So we worked on that.
Yeah, well, you better identify yourself.
Hello.
To the beautiful young lady.
Oh, Dad. I was just curious, what the reaction on the island was to your first book, if there was any, if you had any interesting interactions, and if that influenced anything about writing your second or third or fourth books.
I did constantly think, there's a friend of mine on the island, Deer Isle has all these writers. Catherine Lee Page, who's a pretty well-known mystery writer, lives on Deer Isle also. And I'd been reading her novels years ago, and I said, you ever think of calling it Deer Isle? She said, you think I'm crazy? There was a kind of parlor game on Deer Isle. Which of these characters are the real people on Deer Isle? And people were pretty disappointed when I told them the only real person in this novel is Demetrius the mechanic at the Irving station, who has fixed Tim Noah's car, actually. In the novel, on page 35, he appears as Plato, because I just wanted to have a real person in the novel. And when I went down to tell Demetrius about this, you know, he's a cranky guy, and he snarls over his, "Hey, Tom, what the hell you want?" I said, "I wanted to show you you're in my new novel." He drops everything. This is great. But he's the only real person in the novel. The rest of them are all kind of stories I've heard. I belong to this drinking club on Deer Isle called Choir Practice. And you hear these great stories. I used to come home and tell Mary Kay everything I'd heard. And one of the themes is it's a much rowdier and more violent place than summer visitors tend to see. It's not this idyllic paradise. There are a lot of hard drugs in the island. There's a lot of violence. I was looking at Facebook the other day, and a female lobster fisherman reported that somebody had shot up her boat the night before. There was a lot of drug use. There's a lot of drug-related violence. There's just a lot of reliance on firearms. I was walking out in the yard, must have been about a year and a half ago, and I heard bang, 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 bang. And I thought, that's not target practice. Sure enough, the police had been firing at a guy who was firing at them. The state police are pretty good about this. They managed to get the guy down without anybody being killed. He was injured, but they didn't kill him, and they got him arrested and got him the psychological help he needed. But you do hear about a lot of violence. Much of it goes unreported. As the saying is on the island, they don't have a police force on the island. We don't want a police force. We take care of our own troubles. I remember there was a heroin dealer 15 years ago. They just told him he had to leave the island, and he did. And they got rid of him. But that's one of the tensions I'm playing with, is this sort of, you know, appearance of paradise, which Maine is in August, with some very harsh realities of domestic violence, incest, drug abuse, and other forms of violence. Well, okay, I think, oh, sorry. He owns the place, so we have to let
I
him.
don't want to leave without saying something about military literature, because, well, you don't cover the military anymore. You do still occasionally review military books for the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
So what can you tell us about the state of military literature, and how do you decide on which books that you review for the Times?
It's funny. My editor at the New York Times Book Review, I think he's probably at least 15. He just feels so young to me. He moved there from the New Yorker. He's very good, very aggressive, and really interesting and thoughtful. Basically, I look at twice a year, I go through all military history-related books coming out in the next 6 months to 9 months. Usually it's about 125 or so books. And I'll pick 10 or so that I think might be interesting and might have certain themes to them that I could connect. I send the list of 10 to him. He says, well, you can't do that because that's already assigned. You can't do that. But these other 8 books, sure. And they send me the 8 books. I read them and decide 3 or so. I do like it. It keeps me current. There are interesting trends right now in history. I think the most interesting one is global history. Unusually, the book I'm reading right now, and I'm not even being paid to read it, so is David Chaffetz's Raiders, Rulers, and Traders as a history of the horse, which basically argues that for about 8,000 years, the horse was the equivalent of what oil is today. Who controlled the horse, controlled economies, controlled war-fighting abilities. And the other thing I'm really fascinated by is the amount of good Native American history that's being written, especially by this Norwegian guy who's now at Oxford, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Pekka Hamelin or something, wrote a terrific book on the Comanches, really changed my understanding of American history. The Comanches as a tribe were probably more powerful, certainly more powerful than the U.S. Army during the first half of the 19th century. And just really interesting in so many different ways. I mean, the fact that the Comanches' great problem, the reason they didn't kill the Navajos is because they needed carbohydrates. A woman can't bring a baby to term if she's living only on protein. And they had all the protein they wanted from the buffalo, but they go to the Navajos and buy corn and squash and beans from them a few times a year and send up convoys. And that's why the Navajos were allowed to live there. Because the Comanches basically wiped out everybody else who got in their way. The reason that the Mexican War was so simple for the United States was there was nobody living in northern Mexico at that point. The Comanches had wiped out every ranchero there and taken all the horses. So I basically just sort of see what's out there and play with it. I have a couple of rules. I really resist reviewing books about the American Civil War. Everything has been written. I mean, we're down to like histories of the brass button west of the Mississippi, 1862, 1864. Literally, there was a book that came out, I think, last year, the 2 weeks when nothing happened after Gettysburg. And the guy got a whole book out of it because it was really unusual. Nothing happened. And I guess on the next page, it was the same. And I also really resist World War II because it's just been overwritten and overstudied. There are so many other wars out there. There are wars in America that people don't even know about. The War of the Black Panthers, which I would argue was a war. The wars of white supremacism, which I would argue are wars. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff out there. And the reason the Times allows me to do it is they said they historically had felt that they had neglected military history as a subject. It was the area in which there was the biggest gap between their readers' interest and their own. They said readers want to read military history. There's a lot of books that come out, but nobody at the book review wants to review them. So I said, I'll be your military history columnist. And they said, okay. Well, thank you very much. I am here to sign books.